Senator Elissa Slotkin has unveiled a bold national security war plan. Her vision centers on reviving the middle class, winning the global tech race, and fundamentally rethinking how Americans are protected in an age of shifting threats and changing geopolitical realities. How can we ensure economic security is a pillar of our national security? What tools should Congress be reaching for in the face of an evolving global tech race, recurring cyber threats, and public skepticism about the government's role? I'm your co-host, Tess Bridgeman, co-editor-in-chief of Just Security with Ryan Goodman. Joining the show today is Senator Elissa Slotkin, a freshman Democrat representing Michigan, elected on the same ballot as Donald Trump in 2024. She previously served in the House and before that in the executive branch at senior roles in the Department of Defense and the CIA, and has fast become a key voice on national security and foreign policy in the Senate, where she serves on the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees. We are so pleased to welcome you to our podcast, Senator Slotkin, as someone who thinks so deeply about and has such deep experience in national security and foreign policy, both at DOD, at the CIA, at the White House, in some of those positions where we had the pleasure of being able to work side by side, and someone who's now really taking up the challenge of how to orient our government to the new threats and the new opportunities we face that are different than in generations past. We can't think of any better person to be having this conversation with us today. So we're just going to roll up our sleeves and jump in, and I'm going to hand it over to Ryan to get us started.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. Looking forward to the discussion. And I figure in our discussion, a large part of it will focus on policy recommendations, prescriptions, how to improve on things. But I thought maybe just to lay the groundwork to start with the diagnosis. And in your recent remarks at the Council on Foreign Relations, you foregrounded economic security as being central to national security. I was also caught by one of your lines in the opening remarks that you gave in your speech, where you also referred to economic security as being important for people to understand how we came to, quote unquote, this fractious authoritarian moment in our history, end quote. Yeah. So I just wanted to start out that way, for you to just describe to folks your vision of what you're seeing in the relationship between the economic problems within the country, facing the middle class, economic inequality, and national security.
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, as the representative of Michigan, which is the state that, frankly, we feel we invented the middle class, right? We invented this idea that you could work at an auto plant and afford the car you were building. I see every single day how the sort of struggle to achieve the American dream is affecting just a huge chunk of people in my state. And I thought it was important in front of a, very highfalutin national security crowd to talk and start there because I did something that was a little bit unusual before I gave this speech. And I actually held foreign policy themed town halls in Michigan. I was in Benton Harbor, Michigan, and in Troy, Michigan, and we just asked people from across the political spectrum to come and talk to us about this weird topic they don't usually talk about, which is foreign policy and national security. And people will tell you what is keeping them up at night. They will tell you where they feel like they're being protected and where they're not. And it just was overwhelming that economic security is the biggest concern they have. They just feel like they don't know how their kids are going to do. They don't know what technology is going to do to jobs. They don't know how they're going to be able to live the life that their parents lived. And that's coloring everything, right? Whether we're talking about tariffs and trade or whatever, it's just like comes up constantly. And they don't feel like they know the way forward from their government. Certainly, number two, what came up was just this real sort of apprehension around tech and particularly artificial intelligence, what that's going to do to us in the next, 10 years. They've heard of it. They know it's coming, but they don't really know what that means. Midwesterners are always concerned about job loss and displacement. So, but also like cyber attacks. Every single person in that room had a personal story with either being hacked or being ransomed or their hospital being ransomed, their K through 12 school being ransomed. And they were just like, the government is just shrugging their shoulders and not doing anything to protect us, even when we call the police. So that came across very strongly. And then I have to say, because this is a national security themed, podcast, they still really believe that they want America to be a leader in the world. But there is a trust deficit after 20 years of forever wars and feeling like we're just not great at these wars of choice abroad.
Mm.
And so we got to earn back that trust. But the good news is they still want us and prefer American leadership any day of the week to Russian or Chinese leadership, right? But they just want to do it in the quote unquote right way. They want us to stop screwing up. And by the way, it's people in the middle of the country who are fighting those wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So those were kind of where I started from, so that I could actually do something I wouldn't have done 15 years ago, write a speech like national security policy for the middle class, like in a much more real way. And so my theory was that warfare has fundamentally changed, that there are deep competitions going on right now on economic issues, on tech issues, especially AI. And then as a consequence of warfare changing and battlefields changing, American citizens are on the front lines and they are not being protected the way normal homeland security should be protecting them. So that was the origin story of the speech.
Um, so one of the questions that we were thinking of asking you about, but it just flows directly from what you just mentioned, is American concerns, longstanding, and across the aisle about forever wars,
Yeah.
and the commitment of American lives and treasure to these endless wars. And so the question is something that I'm sure is in the foreground of your mind. It's on the front page of the newspapers these days, is where we're going with potentially drug cartels. And we could focus and wrap our minds around the particular strike against the alleged Venezuelan drug boat that happened last week, but it really seems to be potentially the opening for something much larger. And just want to get from you what you're thinking about in terms of what that direction might be, what Congress's role might be, especially given you've had the experience being directly at the top of policy at the DoD itself, how you're thinking about this.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, you can't shake a stick in Michigan without finding someone who's got also a personal story with addiction in their family, with what fentanyl has done. Like it's very real for people and it's killing people. And so I don't have a problem at all going after cartels, and being more aggressive with cartels. But we live in a society where there has to be a process and normal process. When there's a ship that you believe, based on intelligence is full of drugs, that are coming to be smuggled into America, is that, we have a Coast Guard, we have rules of engagement, we have a way of boarding those ships, of shooting the motors of those ships and then arresting them, and that is a different tactic than, immediately blowing them out of the water. By the way, as an intelligence officer, I would love to have a little bit more intelligence on these cartels, and that's what we don't have from this attack because they obliterated, the ship. But I think for me, it's about rules of engagement, and I don't mind being more aggressive and assertive vis-a-vis those cartels. I don't, but I want to know that the rules of the road live up to our values, and that we're frankly, I mean, we're using the authorities that already exist. This is my same concern with National Guard and active duty military in our streets. Like, you want to clean up DC, you want to clean up LA or any of these cities. Talk to the local law enforcement there about how many more officers they'd like to hire.
Mm.
Talk to the people who are trained to handle those kinds of issues. Or in DC, like, don't fire the Parks Department people so that you have to have National Guardsmen picking up trash, right? So I just think there are rules and ways of doing things. And the president has decided that to look muscular, he wants to use the military forward in all these roles, when in fact, the professionals who know how to do this just need the resources and the mandate, and they will go after it.
And I think something you just said that's so important to highlight is that the tools we have need to align with our values. There's a reason that we use certain tools, right, in certain contexts, because it's the values of our Constitution, simply the values of not sending the military to police the streets. because that's not the proper role, right, of those in uniform who signed up to serve. We have tools that actually are fit to purpose for some of these challenges. For other challenges, and this is something you spoke about at length in your speech, we need new tools, right? Or we need to open the toolbox in new ways. So I want to shift us a little bit and get into some brass tacks on China, because China comes up a lot in these conversations. And I think we would just start by leveling that there is a real threat. And the cyber threats you talk about in particular are acute, and they're ones that people feel in their daily lives, as well as in secret squirrel corners of our government, right, where China is also extremely active. And so those concerns that you're hearing from your constituents, they're very real. At the same time, I don't think any of us want to create a boogeyman, right? Or a new Cold War, or God forbid, a hot one. Could it be avoided? And so there's this real question with our overall bilateral relationship of how we compete where we need to and cooperate where we can, right? That's a mantra of the past, but I think it's one that might still have some continuing value today. And just to give one brief example, right? The New York Times reported this week that China is pushing to sell batteries, solar panels, wind turbine technologies in emerging markets, and that on the whole, it might actually be creating the conditions for reducing global use of fossil fuels. And this just strikes me as something that's really in line with what you were saying before about how we need to compete, right? The role of Michigan, but our country more broadly, in creating those technologies, getting into those markets, not being outcompeted by China. But at the same time, is there scope for us to be racing to the top instead of racing to the bottom here, and actually cooperating with China on reducing fossil fuel use? So I guess the question broadly is, do you think there's scope for cooperation as well as competition? And where do you see that? Where do you see us being able to take down the temperature just enough to say, we don't need to create a boogeyman. We don't need to get into a Cold War type situation. We need to compete, but we also need to cooperate. And here's where we can do that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, um, only national security folks would think like we don't already cooperate every single day with the Chinese. Like, come to Michigan, right? Like the auto industry, look at our supply chains. And whether I like it or not, just how deeply we are connected to China every single day in everything we buy, in everything, we aspire, the thing we want to buy for Christmas. Like, I guarantee you there's some sort of Chinese part in there. And Michiganders understand this because we're in that industry, right? And we saw during COVID how supply chains were literally weaponized. So we do cooperate. It does not have the ability to be a Cold War when our rare earth minerals, for the phones that we enjoy, come from a place like China. So if anything, if I'm home in Michigan, while people feel deeply frustrated on the job loss over the last 30 years in manufacturing to places that have cheap labor like China, I'll have just as many conversations being like, hey, we really depend on this widget from China. We really need this in order to build these largely American appliances or whatever. And so can we please keep the temperature down? Like, it's a part of our lives. So yes, of course, we need to continue to cooperate and do business with them. But I think we just have to be upfront that the competition and the adversarial relationship is not just on the military side, right? I mean, look at drones. If your kids want to buy a drone for Christmas, and in the United States of America off Amazon, they have DJI, right? A Chinese company, and then a few other Chinese options. Well, that wasn't always the case. We did have American sort of commercial drones, like for fun. And then the Chinese largely took the IP, reverse engineered it. And then the government subsidized the price of that drone so much that they absolutely crowded out all the American competition. That is economic warfare. And so let's call it for what it is, right? And I think we just need to be more upfront about the fact that, like, we know we've got a military issue, Taiwan, and the Straits of Taiwan, and I mean everything, right? But there is legit competition and even warfare going on in the economic side and in the tech side every single day, and we're just sort of pretending that we can silo all the competition over to the military side. And that's just not the case. And the truth is, I don't believe that the only way we could come into conflict with China is a traditional military war. And I know that our friends in the Defense Department, and I was one of them, right? Like we do tabletop exercises and war games, and we think about this all the time. Right now, if there was a cyber attack this winter for the Eastern Seaboard, right, and it took out our power, and 280 elderly people froze to death in their homes in Michigan. Well, what do? They just killed American citizens on our soil. That was a homeland attack. It was from a group that they pretend is not affiliated with them, or they try to, they say they have deniability. What is America's proportional response? We don't typically think of ourselves going into a place like China or Russia and killing 280 of their elderly people. We don't have doctrine for this. This is a new type of threat. And my argument in my speech is like, Americans are on the front lines. We know they have the ability to do these things. We need to rethink completely how we define homeland security and get our shit together to protect American citizens in this new era. And it doesn't help us just by pretending the competition is just in the military side of things.
Yeah, I think it's something that we've recognized for a long time, but haven't grappled with
Yes.
sufficiently, that it doesn't matter if an attack is from a missile or ones and zeros, right? An attack is an attack if those effects are felt. And that's something that we need to be really serious about. But taking us back to what you were just saying about competition in the tech sphere, because I think that's an important one to drill down on. So let's do brass tacks on that for a minute. So what would it actually look like, right, for the United States to compete with China on AI, right? So
Yeah.
our starting point is we don't really subsidize our industry here.
No.
We aren't investing in research. In fact, we're sort of tearing down our universities at the moment. We're not attracting AI talent into the country. We don't have great visa programs at the moment, right? And when you look at the investments of our largest AI companies, this isn't a rule, but it's a trend, right? They're focused on these sort of AGI moonshots rather than on incorporating existing AI tools into our companies and our government to make them more efficient, to make them more profitable, right? To kind of get a leg up in the market. So given where we're starting, right, and the fact that we don't have as a nation a policy, right, that would drive us towards adoption of those technologies in the same way that China is doing, what should we actually do? What should Congress do? Should we be thinking about subsidies? Should we be thinking about changing up our export controls? Should we be thinking about the way that we attract talent, research in universities? What do you think are the most effective ways?
Well, I certainly agree with you that cutting off our knees on research is just about the least strategic thing I've heard Trump do. I mean, it's inane for this. So yes, we should be increasing funding on some of these key fields, not decreasing funding. And I think AI is sort of first among equals on the technology races that I see going on because it can have such an exponential impact on all the other type of technologies. But, I had this kind of realization when I went to a couple weekends ago to Los Alamos National Lab in Santa Fe. They are building a new AI partnership and a wing of the lab, and that's at University of Michigan. So we're interested in that. I went out to visit them. And I really came away with saying, there are some analogous ways to look at AI the way that legal, folks and policymakers had to think about nuclear energy back in the day and the race to a nuclear weapon. You have this game-changing technology that can do unbelievable damage, but also can do unbelievable good in the form of energy. And whoever gets it first is in pole position, is in a really important position. And what did we do, right? We literally set up the Manhattan Project with congressional support, with money, with resources. We brought the best scientists, including many, many immigrant and foreign scientists, to come into that project. And they did something unbelievable, right? Well documented and just an astounding accomplishment, not without its challenges in terms of, what it was they just built. But then how did they manage the after effects of that, of like discovering such a dangerous thing? We set up here in Congress the Atomic Energy Commission, where private sector leaders, CEOs of companies, literally sat with lawmakers to figure out the rules of the road for nuclear energy and the good things that can come from this new discovery. I'm proposing a very similar thing, that Congress could make a decision right now, that we understand, despite the polarization and the bickering and, talking about stupid things like the Cracker Barrel logo and stuff, we could instead do what leaders are supposed to do and think around corners and out further and say, AI is different. We're going to set up this Manhattan Project. We know the importance of discovering things first. We're going to bring the brightest and the best, and then we're going to set up something more normalized to help us figure out the right and left limits for all the positive uses for AI. That's to me. Now, the private sector owns a lot more of the AI research and technology than the government does. And that's a fundamental difference from World War II era. But we got to deal with it. Like, it is what it is. So bring a forum together where we can meter these things out at a very high level. Those are the things I think Congress, if we were not bickering amongst ourselves, we would be focused on like 24/7.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to bring up something you already touched on, and that's the use of the military in American streets, and something that you, in previous remarks, have also highlighted, which is the lack of any hearings in Congress on this kind of pressing topic, with whether it's nationalization of the Guard, federalization of the Guard, or it's the use of the Marines in LA. And I guess the one question I wanted to kind of put to you, especially given that you've worked in the executive branch at highest levels and now you're in the Senate, what would those hearings accomplish? So are the purpose of the hearings in a certain sense to provide better information to the public? Is it to provide information that Congress is not receiving? Is it to kind of bring in what is not otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, happening as much, as is just congressional oversight? So there actually is a visible exchange of ideas and information with executive branch officials. What's the kind of pathway forward, given that public opinion data seems to be suggesting that there's a lot of concern across the country about this issue, and there's certainly a lot of concern that people don't want it necessarily to happen in their own cities and towns.
Yeah.
So how are you thinking
Yeah.
about that?
So I think all of the above. I think number one, it's literally our job. I mean, to provide oversight. It's in the Constitution. It shouldn't be hard to get my peers on any of these committees to actually do oversight as just a measure of self-respect, of like, the jobs that we hold as senators and what our founders designed our system to do. That's number one. Number two, certainly hearings bring attention to issues. And I think, think about the hearings with RFK. For many folks back home, they'll see a snippet of that on the local news. Maybe they'll see it on their news app in a way that just doesn't break through when you don't have kind of the galvanizing moment of the hearing. But then I think it's also just in its best moments, hearings, whether public or private, are helping senators think about the right way forward, again, not just for any one president, but for the country. And I think this issue in particular is one of the, what I call sort of strategic and irreversible problems, that once we kind of break the seal and start sending uniformed military in all the time, declaring emergencies all the time, it becomes habit. We break down this norm that we've had since our founding, that uniformed military in our streets are not something we want to see. That might be common in other countries. We don't want it here. It also, I think taints the institution that I really love, right? The uniformed military does incredible things to keep this country safe. I don't want 16-year-old kids in Washington, D.C. being scared of people in uniform, right? I don't want them to learn that lesson. And I come from Michigan, and I cannot tell you how the legacy of 1967 and National Guardsmen coming in during our riots, our very violent riots, and making it worse because they weren't trained. They didn't have law enforcement tactics. They didn't know how to de-escalate. It made it worse. And people in Detroit still talk about it. Still. So I don't want that for a million reasons. So for all of that, that is why we should be doing the bare minimum and having hearings on this. The Armed Services Committee is usually very bipartisan, even with everything going on. We have an NDAA draft right now that's like very bipartisan. But we also have to do what's right for the country. And I think this is a bare minimum requirement.
So that's a really, I think, helpful way to think about where Congress as an institution needs to go from here in a bipartisan way on some of these big issues in front of us, the military in our streets being, I think, foremost among them. But we have a range of issues, right, where unfortunately we don't have anything resembling bipartisanship. And you spoke in your national security speech last week about the camps on the Hill that either see this Trump term as more of the same or as an existential threat to our democracy. And you put yourself in the latter camp. I have to admit, that's where I am personally as well. And you said, once that assessment is made, we need to open up the toolkit and think about how we're actually going to get the transparency we need at a bare minimum, right? Things like holding the hearings, but also what we can do more creatively to use the toolkit. And so I just wanted to draw you out a little bit on what specific tools do you think could be used that aren't being used right now, if folks were willing to do so? Are we talking about objecting to UC, holds, filibusters, the 2-hour rule? We could go on with all these, procedural tools out of the toolkit. Is it about individual senators using those tools at their disposal? Is it about working in, coordination so that these tools are more effective? Is it about getting leadership, right, to prioritize breaking up of silos so that folks can work together? Perennial issue, right, on the Hill is the siloing. It's not just the executive branch that silos itself. What are the kinds of tools that you think aren't being used that should be used that could meet the moment?
Yeah. So look, there are some additional procedural tools in the Senate when you're in the minority. They're not great. No one would ever say that they break through to the American people, like whether you slow something down or speed something up. They're important, but I think much more expansively than just the tools in the actual Senate. I think my position coming from the CIA and the Defense Department is that if you really believe something is a threat, you need to use all the tools in the toolkit. And for us, as senators, beyond the tools we have here, we have convening power as senior leaders to get the coordination we need between all the different actors out there. So I'll give you the example that comes, to mind first is on our legal strategy. We have a lot of really wonderful legal organizations and people doing pro bono and, people who are really playing this pushback role to Donald Trump because that's where we have an actual hook in the ground often. There should be a coordinated approach to that. It shouldn't just be a jump ball for the great organizations that are working on these things. We should be very deliberate. And in fact, the Republicans are very deliberate. When they have a case they really care about, they think about which law firm, which judge, which path to the Supreme Court. How do we build momentum among the grassroots? How do we rally around something we think that is important, right? And Democrats, it's that jump ball approach. So to me, there's a coordination role, a convening role that senators should be playing, and that is for our friends in the legal world, but also in the political world, right? The way that there's so much demand signal from the grassroots, like what's the plan? What's the direction? What should I be doing to help the country I love? Tell me. And the answer can't be, well, we just have to wait, right? We have to wait for the elections, which are important in 2026, of course. But that's not enough. And I think the way that being at the Defense Department really affects me on this is you don't You don't go to kick ISIS out of Mosul by having the Marines do one thing and the Army do another and, the Air Force doing their own thing. It's coordinated. Not everyone gets to do exactly what they want, but you're working as a team. And that to me is a fundamental responsibility of leaders. And so that's the kind of thing. It's like, it's kind of the blue sky of it all. Yes,
Yeah.
we're senators. Yes, we need to do more here inside the Senate, but this is bigger than the Senate. And we have a job as leaders that are much bigger than our statutory role right now. And I feel that that's an issue of debate among senators and among elected Democrats across the board right now.
So one quick follow-up on that. I couldn't agree more with your analogy. There's different lines of effort. You're going to have a sync meeting every morning. You're going to figure out who's doing what. You're going to work together where you need to and get out of each other's way where you need to and make sure that all systems are firing together. But the one example you gave, litigation, it's an incredibly important one. Ryan and I are both lawyers. We're following it closely. The courts will be the courts at the end of the day. They're not going to save us in ways that I think many of us don't find particularly surprising anymore. Sadly, we're not necessarily seeing a bulwark across all fronts. We're seeing the courts do their job in some really important cases, and that's extraordinarily crucial. But the courts alone are not going to save us. What else can you do with your convening power aside from coordinating litigation strategy, making sure it maps onto communications and movement building and all of the things you just said? What else outside of litigation can our elected leaders be doing to meet this moment?
Yeah.
There's a real
So look, I'm a practical person. And if I think about what was the most effective pushback we offered in Trump's first term, what is something where we literally robbed him of a signature goal that he campaigned on and obsessed about? It was repeal of the ACA, of Obamacare. He literally talked about it for 2 years straight. And in fact, the House of Representatives did repeal it. He had a big Rose Garden ceremony to celebrate it. And it was because of John McCain, right, who flipped his vote in the Senate that we did not repeal the ACA. But why did John McCain and others feel empowered to do that? Because the tide had turned in the country. That basically Obamacare had gone from something that people were very suspicious of and didn't love when it first came out to something that they felt was a right. And you're not going to take away my health care. How did we do that? Because it's not like my neighbors woke up in 2017 and knew all about Obamacare and the marketplace and coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. No, we basically through the 2018 cycle mobilized the grassroots to be talking about healthcare, to be pointing out how, the unbelievable stories of people who would not be alive if they didn't have it. My own mother didn't have health care when she was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. I talk about that pain that so many Americans they know it personally because everyone's got a terrible story with the healthcare system. To me, that playbook of coordinating and working with key grassroots organizations to tell those stories, whenever people are like, what can I do? I'm like, have a press conference, put out a press statement, put out an op-ed, tweet about your healthcare, talk about what is about to happen in this country again, which is every single person listening to this podcast is either at risk of losing their healthcare or having their private insurance prices go up. You're all going to get the letters this fall. Sorry. It's unbelievable because I don't know a single American who thinks we're paying too little for our healthcare. But in Michigan, private healthcare is going to go up between 10 and 20% by January 1. We're getting the letters now. Okay. That is, to me, where we need to press, because while democracy issues are top of mind for a lot of people, for many people that I represent, they're just trying to get through the month. And understanding what this man is doing and how he said he promised that he was going to lower your costs. And in every category, especially the whoppers like healthcare, he's making it go up and not down. So it's a grassroots mobilization that has a disproportionate effect on a populist president. If you want to know what the center of gravity is for this guy, it's the popular vote, particularly in swing states, turning against him. And that is where our energy should be focused.
Telling our stories as a national security imperative.
Absolutely.
We know you are out of time, and we just can't thank you enough for all that you've brought to this conversation, but more important, all that you're doing to elevate the discourse on these issues in your home state, nationally, in the Senate, and wherever you tell your story. So thank you for coming on and being with us today. We hope to have you again soon.
Appreciate you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you. This episode was hosted by me, Ryan Goodman, and Tess Bridgeman, and produced by Maya Neer and Isaac Rubenstein. Special thanks to Senator Elissa Slotkin. We'll also put in the show notes a link to her recent remarks and a conversation at the Council on Foreign Relations. You can read all of Just Security's coverage of national security and congressional oversight on our website. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Thanks for joining us.